Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for SEFLIN Social Services and Libraries Discussion Group. Today, we have Athy Fito. She is, and I think Paula Frack might be on the call as well. Athy is our co-chair for the SEFLIN Social Services and Libraries Discussion Group. And Athy is the branch manager at the Kendall Lakes Library and the Lakes of the Meadow Library, because one library is not enough for Athy. So Athy, will you take it away and introduce Dr. Cannon for us? Thank you so much.
Today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Peter Cannon, PhD. He's the communication officer for the University of South Florida's School of Information and a veteran of library service, with many years of experience working in the field of information science. He's also the director of the Drug Abuse Comprehensive Coordinating Office Library, an information center designed to deliver bibliotherapy services to women in residential treatment centers. He taught technical writing at the University of South Florida, where he's received his PhD in rhetoric. You can learn more about Dr. Peter Cannon at https://works.bepress.com/Peter Cannon, all one word. Dr. Cannon, take it away.
Great, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I think everyone can hear me. This is a pleasure to be here. Melanie, Afy, this is, we've been meeting many times about this project. This is a shared, I think a shared passion between the three of us. And this is something that we have fully embraced here at the University of South Florida. We're gonna be 2.5 hours, I believe, today. We're gonna have some breaks. I also have some discussion time fit in to this presentation. And this is going to be one of 3. So the first part, the first e-course is going to cover mostly theory, and I'll go through what we're doing. But let me see if I can go ahead now. And I don't want to mess anything up here. So I'm also the program coordinator for the Responsive Librarianship Lab, which is an initiative that we have at the University of South Florida School of Information. And we do a lot of research, we do a lot of outreach, but the main thing that we do is that we help create and administer therapeutic libraries for different populations. And this is the 3 of us here. If anyone knows anything about University of South Florida, my 2 partners here, Denise and Natalie, are wonderful, and they're one of the the driving forces behind this initiative here. But today, I just want to go over what all 3 courses will cover, which is the theoretical aspects behind responsive librarianship, as well as what we'll be getting into part 2 and part 3, more application. But this theoretical part, I feel, is useful for a lot of people who are interested in perhaps starting a responsive librarianship program in their library or information center. Because today what we'll be covering is theory and responsive librarianship. And then we have, later we're gonna have responsive librarianship scheme, what it actually looks like, and then incorporating your community-based programming into a responsive librarianship scheme. So I wanna start off with just a little bit of theory and background, what it is. So we define it as the delivery, let me just go ahead, I'm gonna move this down just a bit here. The delivery of personalized library services in response to rhetorical exigence that produces a modification of the reader's situation. I'm not gonna read every slide, so don't worry about it, but this is important because this is the definition of responsive librarianship. And there's some important concepts that we have in this definition. It's foregrounded in rhetoric, and we use the rhetorical situation as an evaluative tool. we break it down into its component parts. So whenever we're looking at starting a responsive librarianship scheme or modifying it for a certain population, we're always looking to put it on a problem, what we call an exigence. And it doesn't have to necessarily be, we don't like to use the word problem too much. It doesn't necessarily have to be bad. It could just be an issue. For example, going to the moon wasn't really a problem, but you can consider that an exigence. We always look at the audience, which is our population. We try and make sure that we can personalize the responsive librarianship services as much as possible. We may not be able to get down to patron level, but what we can do is we can, based on data, we can try and ascertain the characteristics, the features of the population we're trying to serve. And we have to look at the constraints. These aren't, again, these aren't problems so much as challenges to a program. Starting a program as librarians and information specialists, we know that we have lots of challenges, especially today, in delivering services to our patrons. And then two other aspects that come in later is the writer, who's just the communicator. It's not necessarily a person who's talking or writing a book. Sometimes we like to think of the communicator as the individual who's reading a book and writing their own story as they read. And then of course the text. It's not necessarily books. It could be speech acts. It could be presentations that our experts give in the community, but it's based in discourse. And so what we're doing is the discourse is our intervention to try and address our exigence. So again, we use the rhetorical situation as our heuristic to try and evaluate the issues facing the library. So what I like to do is start off right away, just because that was a lot to try and digest, is to take a minute or so and think about problems or issues you think you have right now in your library, or maybe a part of the population. So just using, and we can go, and I'll go back and give you the elements, but if you can think about using the rhetorical situation like an exigence that you see, a population that needs services, or maybe there's something, another program that you would like. And I'm going to put this back. So I'm just going to give us a minute maybe so we can talk about this. We're going to have discussion during this presentation. So this is the rhetorical situation. And if you have a question, please speak up. Everyone is free to chime in at any time.
I have a question. So
Yeah.
rhetorical exigence is like a hypothetical problem? Is that what you're defining it as? It's
not hypothetical. It is an issue that perhaps one segment of your patron population is experiencing. For example, anxiety, right? A lot of people now are experiencing anxiety either based on economic insecurity, food insecurity, everything that's going on with the pandemic. You may have a population of teens that they're struggling. And so that's the exigence, is trying to figure out, what kind of problem you want to try and address. Does that make sense there, Paul?
I think so. I'm
Yeah.
still maybe not clear on the rhetorical part. Like,
So
someone
forget
communicated
rhetorical.
it? Is that, yeah.
So rhetorical means that we're solving problems with discourse.
Okay.
We're not using wrenches or dump trucks or anything like that. We're using speech acts, text, and so forth. And it's a lot of what we do, right? And library services is we help people. It's a discursive act, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So there's really no wrong answers. So does anyone else have any ideas? Any questions? So I can tell you one of the things that we were looking at early on. I was talking to a mental health counselor at a residential treatment program. I was crossing the street and we just got talking and she said, "Oh, you're a librarian?" I said, "Yeah." And so I had asked, "Well, what's your library like?" She said, "What library?" They didn't have a library. This was a residential program where women were in there anywhere from 8 months to a year. So then we had, that's how this discussion started. So we started to talk about maybe starting a library program in the facility for the women. And these, the women were there for drug and alcohol treatment. So we focused on the delivery of library services, not just books. Anyone can just take books and just drop them off and say, "Here you go." But we wanted to make sure that it was an ecological view. So we wanted to create a program to deliver services that were consistent with their treatment goals and health outcomes. We weren't treating them themselves, but we wanted to make sure that they had the right types of materials. And it wasn't just do-it-yourself books or, addiction for dummies or something like that. We wanted to make sure that we gave them a broad range of materials and library services, including health literacy, mental health literacy, and information literacy. So that was our exigence, and it was because it was women at this residential treatment program. It was a different population because they were disenfranchised. They weren't very empowered. And so those are like the exigences that come up. So does anyone else have any examples they'd like to talk about maybe? And it was kind of early, but the idea is to get this, get you thinking and making notes as we go along. So let's see. And we had a new definition of agency. We describe agency as traditionally as the ability to do something. So some populations, some people, some patrons don't have the ability to do something or quite so much the opportunity to do something as others. So when we look at agency in terms of creating a program, we're looking to create change over time. And we're taking an ecological approach, and I'll show you what that looks like. But in ecology, when we talk about a library ecology, we're looking at the interconnected networks of events. So it's not just books, it's not just librarians, but everything that could come into all the actions and relationships that could come into play, for lack of a better term, when trying to create a program for a specific population or segment of your service population. So there's nobody on top. People aren't on top, books aren't on top, everybody's equal, and they kind of shift. It's kind of, if you think of like an ocean in the waves or in a tidal pool, everything kind of shifts. And that's what a library ecology looks like. And so when we were trying to discern, well, what does our ecology look like, or what would a responsive librarianship ecology look like? We started, well, with the librarians naturally, because they were the specialists. And then we thought, well, book lists. We want to create book lists for people to read, therapeutic book lists that a patron could, pick up off the shelf or pick up off the internet. And then we decided, well, that wasn't just enough, because we don't know if there's going to be change over time. And we don't know if they're going to get it's going to be, the most efficient way to create that change over time. So then we decided, well, why don't we create these book talks based on these book lists? And these book talks, these book clubs, really, that's what it is, where people would get together and talk about not so much one book, but a group of books that had a similar theme. So then we were talking, well, what else do we want to do with that? Do we just want people to talk about the books and go away? So then we thought, well, why don't we go ahead and incorporate some community-based programs? So I have down here like little person exercise. And so one of the programs that we have dealing with anxiety. So we have a book talk about anxiety. And then we have a program of mindfulness breathing. And this is a community expert, someone who's in the community, not very far from the library, who online right now, who talks about mindfulness and mindful breathing. And then we decided, well, is there something else that we can add? Because people naturally, if they start talking maybe about anxiety or their emotions, they may want more information. And that's a positive information seeking behavior. That's what we want. We want people to participate in what we would call an intervention and to have more questions or to take more actions. So we decided, instead of just making it a loop, let's bring in someone else. And that someone else was social workers. So we at the University of South Florida, we have a school of social work, and we have the opportunity to work to collaborate with them, work closely with them. So we have a social work intern who participates in all of our programming. And she's there to offer resources in case someone has a question or wants to develop an issue further. Maybe they do want some counseling, and our intern can go ahead and refer them to the appropriate person or agency. Sometimes it's just a question that's better handled by a mental health professional. So we wanted to, bring that person or that group or that relationship really into our ecology. And you can see it's getting a little big now. And then what we did is we wanted to bring in other expert voices. These were experts in neuroscience, neurospecialists, people who specialized in evidence-based practices, because there's a lot of research out there. And we know that as librarians, because, that's our job, is to, catalog all that. But we wanted to bring them into the conversation. What books would be good, or, is there, a type of book or a type of genre that could be helpful, as opposed to just, again, the traditional CBT book, how to deal with a problem based on behavior, or more didactic. So bringing in these specialists, we thought was a good idea, and kind of expanded, again, our ecology, made our toolbox bigger. So then when we start bringing in more people, there's one thing that we all realize is that we now have a lot of data, and understanding the data that we have and trying to analyze that means that we had to bring in other experts. This is not all cost. Every time I click on this button doesn't mean that I'm expanding the cost of this program. It's actually good because I'm expanding the reach and bringing in more voices. And if you remember, when we started, it was just librarians and books. So now we have this ecology where everyone is participating and everyone is affecting, you could say, the ebbs and flows. And then, naturally, we decided to reach out to people in mental health facilities, medical facilities, to see if these were services that were interesting or could be helpful. It's one of our main things is does this help? How can this be helpful? And then when you go into a facility, you also want to make sure that you're bringing in the health professional, the mental health professionals into the conversation, because they have a lot of input. And we found that their input was unique and very interesting about what their patients or what their residents may like. Right now we have 2 programs, one in a pediatric crisis care center and another in a residential drug treatment center. 2 different populations, 2 different types of health professionals, but they both participate and collaborate in very unique ways. And then, of course, administrators. You have to get your administrators on board, your stakeholders.
Dr. Cannon?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because we're really kind of looking at two different groups, and one is a kind of a youth type program. Can you just maybe speak a little bit to what that looks like, those programs?
Oh, you mean both the adult residential treatment program and the
Yes.
youth program?
Yes.
Oh, sure, sure.
That'd be awesome.
So, yeah, so everything that I have up here, you know, I could use this diagram to explain each program. So our latest program is the Pediatric Crisis Care Center. It's up in Land O'Lakes, and it's for children, preteens and teens who are either a threat to themselves or to others. Most of the time they're Baker acted, and they have a lot of issues. They don't have a lot of systems of support at home. And the ones that we interact, you know, they love to read. They like libraries. Sometimes they don't have libraries, especially up in Pasco. But we found it was an appropriate setting to create a library. So what we did is we developed a collection that is for children 8 years old and up. So that includes, again, you have board books, picture books, and then you have your YA literature, chapter books, and so forth. And then we go there. We haven't been able to do that since the pandemic because this is a restricted area, but we would go and provide library services 3 days a week between librarians, and we have graduate assistants in our library. So we would go and provide circulation services. So they don't get to just pull the book out and go read it. They have to wait for the library open. And that was, you know, one of the things we wanted to do is to replicate library services. So when they were released back into the community, they knew there was an institution that they felt comfortable with, and they go, I know how that works. So we would have circulation services. We would have book clubs, reading clubs, where we would read an individual book or, again, a group of books. And for this population, a lot of it was on anxiety or depression. So we'd read, you know, these books, and then we would have these programs, these community-based services, and we would do different things based on the types of books. For example, we had one program where we did graphic novels dealing with anxiety and depression. And so we would talk about that. And then they had to create their own comic strip. And then they talked about it. And then another activity or interventions where they had to share and create a group comic strip. And each person would draw something. So based on the book list that, and we also, excuse me, I should start off as we created book lists for different types of issues. And, you know, the residents could go in and look at a book. They're restricted in what they can and cannot take out, but they, you know, they could go in and take a look at this book, kind of like a catalog, online catalog, but we had it separated by issue. Eating disorder, body image, again, depression, anxiety, bullying. So we separated by exigence. Going back to what Paul and I were discussing, you know, these were, you know, exigences that we saw that we should address. We can't solve them. We can't, you know, make all these problems go away. But the idea is change over time. And so what we saw, and the qualitative data that we got so far from the mental health professionals, is they found that they were engaged with the library. A lot of the residents were engaged in the programs. They really enjoyed it. Some of the residents who weren't as talkative the mental health professionals found that they could talk about the library or the programs to kind of get them to open up. And in group sessions, sometimes they would talk about the book or some books that they were reading. So that change, that positive change, again, we're not, we're not solving problems, we're creating change over time. And then the adult program is similar. Residential treatment program, the women are there for anywhere from 8 months to a year, and we create similar types of services. There's a collection of books, and we have them split up into tracks, and we also provide them with like multiple copies of a book that the mental health providers can take into group sessions, and they can read and discuss. And these sessions that we would have after could be mental health literacy, because a lot of times when they're released, they're on their own. They don't have much support. And usually they're under some sort of sentence, probation, community service or something. So they do have to do some work. They do have to report to people, but a lot of times they don't have the sources or the information to do that. So we want to make sure that we're providing them with those skills either to for mental health, or information literacy, how to find that in the community. We do that just by teaching them or helping them find those sources in this residential center. Does that help, Melanie? Do you think that's?
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Oh yeah, no problem. And I'll refer to these programs. Now, what we've done now is we've taken that model, which is a pediatric model and an adult women's model, and we're now placing these two models into the community in 3 library systems, and they look very different. These are, again, they're flexible, and you have to personalize them based on the population.
Right. And can you talk maybe a little bit about the genre of books that you're finding? Is there a specific genre for the youth and kind of the women's that you're finding to be effective?
So we use a variety of books. We use, young adult literature we find is useful for both populations because it's easy and it's quick read. However, the adult population, I'm going to get into this a little bit more when we talk about the tracks. They wanted something different based on our assessment of the program. So they enjoyed reading mystery novels, adult literature, just adult fiction, books that they could escape, basically use the book as a vehicle to escape from their issues and their problems. Both groups, both populations also like using graphic novels. We found that graphic novels were very effective in folks that had low literacy or low motivation. And we could use the graphic novels in a variety of ways, either as a way for relaying or conveying health information, or for just increasing some of those literacy skills that were not developed previously. So, but I'm going to get more into the books and the genres when I get into the tracks, because again, they're all it's all personalized depending on your population. You can see how that's done. But if we get back to stakeholders, a couple more things that we wound up, and I think everybody's kind of familiar with that, is funding. Funding is always an issue, but because the ecology allows for this to be flexible, your funding can be flexible too. So we, as a R1 research institution, we have to apply for a lot of grants, and in order to do that, we have to make sure that the data that we collect, which is on the other side of this here, comports with the data collection requirements for the funding agency. And then finally, one of the things is when you're collecting data in a program like this, these are not randomized controlled trials or medical trials where we collect, we think it's rather invasive to collect demographic data. So we're data resistant when it comes to the personal information for our participants. But that also means it's harder to apply for grants and to get funding. So here's an example. This is an example of the DACO, the Residential Treatment Center. This is what their ecology looks like. This was, so, you know, addiction seems to be driving it, but it's not in the center. What was into center, almost in the center is the library, health information, mental health information, and the residents and everything. But that is what a real library, therapeutic library ecology would look like. And that's, you know, there's a lot of relationships there. So one of the things we could discuss, and just for you maybe to take notes as you're going along and thinking about it, is, you know, if you start using the ecological model to, as well as the rhetorical situation, when you start thinking about exigences and so forth. So what are some of the network connections, relationships, people that you could probably recruit, engage, or employ in developing a new program? Again, we're thinking outside of the box. And I know we do a lot of library programming, and it's different today. But, you know, I'll give you a couple minutes, maybe you can think of some additional members of the ecology that you can bring in. If anyone has any questions or examples, it'd be a great time. Does anyone have any questions or examples of maybe something new in creating
Actually,
a library?
I do see a question. Did you include book clubs for their parents as well, is one question.
For the pediatric residents, no, we did not. The reason why is that for this facility, for the crisis care facility, they have very limited contact with the outside world. Their parents do come in, they do come in for an hour. That is something that we're looking at. One of the things that we did want to do is have a conversation with the parents, but that was something that we needed to, there were a lot of legal hurdles on that, but that's what we're trying to do in our public library model, but we haven't been able to figure that out yet in the pediatric crisis care center. But that would be a good example of bringing in someone into this ecology.
Okay, and we have another question, is a question from Palm Beach County Library System, a question about each partnership. Is there a letter of understanding or some kind of contract developed with each community organization?
So it depends on your how you do regular library programming. If your library is a library that likes to have people just come in and provide library programming without an MOU, then that's fine. It may be easier for scheduling to have those. It's definitely a great idea to make sure that there are boundaries and guidelines and so forth if someone has not provided any programming before. But I would say it's a good idea to always have some sort of agreement, but also you want to be flexible and you don't want too many layers of bureaucracy. So I think, for example, Hillsborough County has if there's anyone from Hillsborough, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they have a list of approved vendors that have been cleared or who have done programming before. So you can draw upon that too. Does that answer your question?
I don't see an answer yet. And I know that we, in the programming that we're exploring, we're kind of looking at those MOUs too on how we navigate, and we're kind of in the midst of developing quite a bit of that.
Right, and it's not a bad thing to have. It's difficult to hold. So, you know, for example, if you want to bring in a yoga instructor who has a private studio and he or she cancels at the last minute, it's hard to hold them to that, right?
Right.
But an MOU can kind of explain, you know, this is what we do, this is what we don't do, and so forth. And then it's all, you know, you can always go back to that person for programming. It's not a bad thing to repeat these after a couple of months too, based on demand. So one of the examples
just the question again, the Palm Beach County person, their question was in relation to the two programs that you were discussing. So.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So the two that we have, yes, we do have an MOU.
With them, okay.
With them, and that is, you know, rather extensive because we have students and people coming in from the outside, and there's a lot of privacy concerns and there's medical information everywhere, and so we do have an MOU for both of those.
Awesome.
Those are great.
And then another question, so would these be network connections such as homeless shelters, outreach contracts? I'd imagine they could inform the library on needed resources as well as steer their clients to us.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And you remember, homeless shelters are going to be subject specialists too. They're going to know their population, and they will be able to provide you insight if that's the exigence you're focusing on. So yeah, absolutely. The idea when you think of, this is good, when you think of ecological thinking, you're just expanding the view of people who you can bring in and have these conversations and collaborate. We're doing a program up in Vermont for people who are out of work. It's called the Retain Program. And so this is a statewide library program. And so we're bringing in what they call care coordinators into our ecology. So instead of just dealing with individual patrons and having them come to the library, we're talking directly with care coordinators who help people throughout the process trying to return to work. They are social workers, and they focus on trying to help people get back to work. What do they need? And so we're a small part of that program, but we thought we could have done it without them, but we thought it would be interesting to bring them into the conversation, and the statewide mental health system too, to see if they had any ideas or any concerns or things to look for, because again, just expanding that ecology helps you expand the program and helps find different ways to focus on that exigence. So how does this work? And sometimes it's interesting to go back to the traditional model of bibliotherapy. If anyone has either participated in a bibliotherapy program or a bibliotherapy course they may have taken at one time, bibliotherapy is very old, it's thousands of years old, right? And it works. We know it works. And usually when I used to introduce bibliotherapy to people, I would say, has anyone read a book and felt good after, and everyone raises their hand and said, well, that's bibliotherapy. The idea is some sort of therapeutic gain from the text that you've interacted with, depending on the text. But bibliotherapy programs were very strong in the United States in the post-World War I in 1920s and 1930s. And then what happened is they weren't very rigorous or robust in their data collection and evaluation. And then it got to be just any book, anything. We weren't really collecting that data. It wasn't data driven. So there was a little bit of a decline in bibliotherapy. And then it became focused on one model. And that one model was, here's a book about your problem. Go read it and identify with it. And it didn't work for a lot of people. So the efficacy rates of bibliotherapy went down. So responsive librarianship, again, not focusing primarily on a book, but the idea of when you are reading a text, and again, it doesn't have to be reading, it could be an audiobook too, or poetry or some alternative form of text. One of the things that we look at is narrative theory. And if you read this quote, the idea, it really resonates with people in the two programs, the residential program and the pediatric crisis care center. When you tell them that your life is a narrative and that it is flexible, reflexive, and it's not for certain, and you can change that narrative. You really can. And Jerome Bruner is a psychologist who kind of pioneered the idea of life as narrative, and it harkens back to the fact that discourse, communication, how we think about ourselves, creates and defines our reality. And you go, wow, that's really out there. It really isn't. When you start labeling people, that's using language to define somebody. The example I also use for my students is, this is a pen. If there's no word for a pen, you really can't say this exists. Or another example I like is I'm sitting at a table right now, and a lot of families have tables at home, like a dinner table, and I'll ask students, what do you eat on? Well, I eat on a dinner table. Where do you do your homework? I do it on a table. It changes based on the language used. So you change the object from a dinner table or a table that you eat at to a work table, depending on the language you use or the action or the events that occur. So it's, again, narrative theory talks about or relies on the fact that discourse can change somebody's, reality, the social construction. So it's not that difficult of a concept when you just start thinking in terms of your own life about how language is important to you. We also rely a lot on neuroscience and cognitive science, and this is where the data-driven, evidence-based portion comes in. And there's a lot of research, and to us, it would be intuitive, but there is a lot of research about the science of reading and reading literature and what it does to our mind, to our cognitive processes. And a lot of the research that we rely upon talks about neuroplasticity. Back in 2013, I'm not sure if anyone really remembers, but there was an article that came out, I believe it was in Nature, and Kidd and Castano were two scientists, and they did a study, and they said, hey, you know what, we found, they're two psychologists, and they found out there was evidence that reading literature improves and helps develop your brain, your mind and your brain. Two different things. And a lot of people are like, oh, that's garbage. And so they tried to replicate that to disprove it. But each time that they did it, they were supporting those findings. And basically what Kidd and Castano found is that depending on the type of text that you read, you activate an individual's theory of mind processing, which is how we socialize. And the more you read, the more you improve in that skill to a point where it's measurable. And they would take people who would read portions of a text and compare them to people who didn't read portions of a text. What they read instead were newspapers or maybe articles from National Geographic. And when they compared the two, there was a measurable difference in the two groups, with the group reading literature having an improved sense of theory of mind. And theory of mind includes empathy, empathetic thinking, being able to mind read. And that's something that's important today. And that's one of the major components that we try and do, is improve our patrons, our residents' empathy skills. Just understanding what the other person is thinking goes a long way to creating or developing social skills. So that's like the second major part. And then what we do is we bring in text analysis, because we don't just want to rely on one genre or one type of book. So we will develop our book lists from a variety of different sources. We'll use traditional library book lists, readers' advisory lists. Novelist is an interesting source that we use. There are other types of lists out there for more therapeutic reading. But then we'll take books, sometimes bestsellers, sometimes books that are being talked about, and put them into a text analysis application to try and ascertain whether there are textual features that can help, develop that theory of mind, that empathetic thinking. And so we have found that there are a series of books that do this. And so what we've been able to do is isolate, I'm not sure how many words here, I think maybe 20, 21 words. The words in green, we've been able to isolate these words. And if we find these words, or high occurrence of these words in a text, then we feel that this is a book that activates empathetic thinking, theory of mind. So this is our list. And then we looked at what we did is just to check to make sure what we kind of, we call it empirical simulation. It's not reverse engineering, but we took all the books that were in the Kidd Castano study, ran them through text analysis, and came up with almost the same results, finding that certain books did have a higher frequency of these words that tended to develop empathetic thinking. The one thing that we did find that was overlooked in the original study is that mystery novels, you can see here in the middle of the screen, Gone Girl has 24 what we call keywords. That mystery novels, modern mystery novels, not thrillers so much, but books where you're trying to predict someone's actions, motivations, that's empathetic thinking. And so we found that a lot of that genre was very useful for treatment purposes or therapeutic purposes. One of the things that we try to say is that it's therapeutic and not therapy. We're not therapists. And so this is an example of taking these words from the list, because at first I didn't really, I was like, wow, that's maybe it's just a coincidence. So pulling some of these words from that list and then going back into the text and reading, well, where do these words occur? So I have 3 examples, and this is from Gone Girl, if anyone has read it. I don't know spoilers, but these are just 3 excerpts. So the first one, and I really think these are interesting, because if you think about it, you go, wow, it's really hard to write that. And some authors are really good at conveying a theory of mind. processes. So the first one is, let's see, I think this is the wife there. I feel myself trying to be charming, and then I realize, so this has 2 words in it. I'm obviously trying to be charming, and then I try to be even more charming to make up for the fake charm. Okay, so that is empathetic thinking. That is, thinking about mind states or other mind states, other people's mind states of mind. Same thing with pretend. So we go to this excerpt here. Same questions over and over, me trying to pretend they're thought-provoking and them trying to pretend they're thought-provoking. Thank God for the open bar, right? And so you go, well, how is that therapeutic? That, if you think about it, that's 3 or 4 levels of mind reading, because, apart from the author relying upon you having this experience, if you think about it, how many times have we pretended to do something that we don't like for someone else? And that is an act of mind reading. So I always go back to an example of difference between good theory of mind and underdeveloped theory of mind. If you have a teenager and you come home, you've had a really hard day, and your teenager is playing video games and it's really loud, and your teen looks and then turns down the volume, that's theory of mind, because your teenager is thinking about your mind, which is a very unique evolutionary skill that we have. And children develop that. It gets developed more throughout life. Sometimes it's underdeveloped. There's research, there's data, there's indications that people who have an addiction to drug or alcohol, their empathetic thinking, their theory of mind processing, their ability to engage that is diminished. So by reading books and activating that theory of mind processing just in their room or just in their bed helps them. And every time you read a book, there's that change over time. And then the third one, which is interesting, Go is a nickname of the sister. And it's a long quote here, but it's talking about what she believes. She believes they're twins. I don't want to spoil it too much, but Go and the main character and protagonist are twins, but he was born first. And so there's this, he's thinking, well, this is what she believes, and this is how she acts based on her beliefs. And that's him trying to read her mind. So these are 3 examples of using data, text analysis, pull certain words or what we would call features out of a book, analyzing and going, oh, this is going to be pretty good for people who want some therapeutic reading. And then this is just, if we were to visualize this is just what text analysis looks like in one of our programs. This is a cosigned bootstrap consensus tree. And basically what it's saying, they're grouped together because they're similar. And we're trying to, what we do is we put in some books to see if they're similar to the ones that we know that activate theory of mind processing. So then what we've done in responsive librarianship is make this interdisciplinary. So we use narrative theory as the basis. Like, you're not stuck where you are. You're not an addict, or you're not someone who's suicidal. You can change that narrative. This is not pie in the sky thing where it's like you don't need medications, or you don't need therapy. The idea is that you can rewrite your narrative. And one of those ways is to do it through books. And it links in with the neurocognitive sciences that tells us there, empirical data that different genres of text can affect your cognitive processes. And then text analysis helps us identify those texts that are appropriate for certain exigence. So, it's the interplay of all three, and it's an interdisciplinary approach. So there's some generalizations that we have about responsive librarianship. Again, it's different than we don't even use the term bibliotherapy anymore. As a matter of fact, people up in Vermont were very worried about that because it sounds too much like therapy. So it's much different than bibliotherapy programs in the past. There is a very robust state-sponsored, state-supported reading therapy program in the UK. As a matter of fact, it is part of their medical system. They have something that's called books on prescription, where your doctor can write you a prescription for a book and you take it to a library, and the librarian effectively fills that prescription by giving you that book. But our program is different because we want to make sure that it's not just reading the book, but it's integrated. We want to make sure that we match the book with the person. Far too many times it was, oh, this is a book about your situation. They would just give it to them, and that person doesn't connect with the book. And so that's a fail. And then when we are about to give a book, or we're going to suggest a book, why this book for this person? So we always want to look at the exigence. We always want to look at the audience that we're trying to reach. And we avoid saying that reading is therapy, because it doesn't always work. Sometimes, again, you need that ecological approach. We don't like to just give out book lists of books that are good, because we feel that you need a little bit more for the individual. Doesn't mean they can't do it on their own, but we feel that there's more value added to it. The outcomes become better. There's more information seeking behaviors if it's beyond them just reading a book. So the book club, these book talks are good. And every once in a while we'll hold a mock book talk. And it's just fun because a bunch of librarians are now doing the work that we do in the community. And it's no different than any book clubs that you have done as librarians as part of your programming. You're just theming it. And when we get to part 2 and part 3 of these e-courses, we're going to show how you can apply that and how to make these book talks, book groups work. Again, it's more than a text, and you integrate the library and the community. That way, when you're trying to address an exigence, people get comfortable with the community and the resources out there. It's not always just on the internet. And sometimes like, oh, that person, that's a yoga instructor or a mindfulness instructor. Maybe I'll go and talk to that person because that's something that I need. Or it could be a resource that they may not have known about online that we bring in. But really, one of the most important things that we have found out is that this program is completely flexible. When dropping this model into various public libraries, state of Vermont is far different than Hillsborough County, and it's far different than the one that we're starting up in Pasco, I think, if Kim is out there, hi. And it's far different than the one that we are starting up in Temple Terrace. And flexibility, being able to be flexible to meet the needs of the community and your patrons, is very important. You don't want to say, these are the types of books we're going to read, these are the topics, because we have found that sometimes patrons come back, the community comes back, oh, that was really interesting. I'd like to do something slightly different. Well, change it, say, well, let's do that again in 3 or 4 weeks. We'll maybe read a different book, but same theme. So the idea is that you have to be flexible within the confines that you have to be able to plan. But flexibility should always be built into it. So this is going to be discussion time 3, introducing a lot of words here. So responsive librarianship may present a new space for what we would call border work, interdisciplinary trading zone, in order to calibrate the competing discourses in library ecology. So yeah, what does that mean? So think of a museum. Museum is not just, so think of like the Natural History Museum. It's not just elephants and bones and saber-toothed tigers. There's a lot of disciplines that go into creating museum space, you know, archaeologists, sociologists, anthropologists, and they all have different ways of talking, different ways of conveying information. They may be talking about the same thing, but sometimes having different vocabularies makes that communication difficult. So we have to calibrate that. So if we're talking to our community partners as librarians, you know, talking to, you know, financial experts, we have to be able to find a common language to be able to bring financial experts into our programming. Sometimes you may bring in a financial expert and they may not understand the demographics of your library community, but they have a lot of useful information. So trying to create that conversation, that border work in the trading zone. So we'll take some time here, talk about, you know, calibration. How do you reach out to different groups of people? And one of the most difficult things is if you're dealing with a disenfranchised population that has a lot of economic insecurity, and trying to bring people in the community. Sometimes some people would think, oh, this is going to be good advertising for me and I may get a lot of business from that. You have to have that conversation with your community experts that this may not be that opportunity that you're looking at. So what are some other you know, motivations? What is, again, that calibration? What is that border work that you can do to bring in your experts, you know, without having to pay them? Sometimes it depends on your budget, and understanding that they are not going to get a financial windfall. This is not a marketing, you know, a monetizing event for them necessarily. So think about, so let's take some time and think about how you can bring in community experts, you know, little money. So let's take some time. And if anyone has any questions, this is the time to ask also. What are we doing?
I have a question, Dr. Cannon. This is Athie.
Yes, hey, Effie.
Okay, so my question is, so with the libraries, because we're dealing with populations that are much less, quotation marks, captive, and in your work with the ones that you've been dealing in Pasco and Temple Terrace and Hillsborough, what have you all done as far as if you have reluctant readers, especially like talking about teenagers or young adults who might be intimidated by the idea of even reading a full novel?
Right. And this is something that we talked a lot about today. And this is goes back to the reading group. So let's talk in terms of books, and I'll give you a specific, let me see if I can find, I'll give you a specific example of a book. So one of the books we're going to introduce into Pasco is Neil Gaiman's Ocean at the End of the Lane. It's a small book, but if you're a reluctant reader or you're not very confident in your reading ability, you may be hesitant to read that. So what we've done in our programming and in our marketing, we want to make sure that that those who may participate, this is just in reference to one book, we tell them you don't have to read the entire book. And often we tell them you may like this book. You don't have to read the book. And you go, what? We'd like for you to read the book. But not all the questions, but some of the questions that we ask during our book clubs or book talks, not ask, but facilitate. What we'll do is we'll read a passage from the book. So you didn't need to read the book to participate. In the passage that I read is self-contained, and the work that you're trying to do is contained in there. It may rely upon one of those terms that we talked about, or it may rely generally on theory of mind thinking, or it may rely on the patron's lived experiences. For example, in Neil Gaiman's book, and I think it's in the prologue, he doesn't say he's going to a funeral, but he talks about that he's putting on the right clothes for a very hard day. So this was, we just read a passage that ended with that phrase. So then we asked, well, what does that mean to you? And have you ever had that experience? And the people who participated in this book talk had very different answers. They didn't need to read the book. All they needed to do was just listen to that passage. And what we found is there was that weaving of their own. This is what we call subjunctive processing, is where we weave our experiences into a book. It's impossible for us to not do that. And how you weave it is therapeutic. So some people, you would think it would be, oh, he's putting on funeral clothes, the right clothes for a funeral. Other people read it as, well, it could be, wearing the right suit for an interview. So it means I have to think about how other people are going to perceive me. Well, how many times does that happen to people? And then the conversation just went on. Well, it was more about me wearing the right clothes that made me feel comfortable. I didn't really care about what other people thought at the interview, but I wanted to make sure that I was dressed appropriate, but I was also comfortable for a hard day. And so that's one way to do it, is when we facilitate questions, we want to make sure that we have passages from the book that have their own therapeutic context there. So you don't necessarily need to read the book. And then we also say you don't need to read the whole book. So we jump around. And again, these discussions become very organic. Also, what we do is we don't just rely on one book. When we create these book lists, we're creating themes, and each book list, each theme book list has around 9 books on it. And we try and spread out the difficulty, right? And so some are, literature, some are, smaller books. And then we always try and include graphic novels or young adult novels. So that's expanding our toolbox. And we do that by focusing. So the exigence helps us. If we're talking about anxiety, then that's like, okay, so that's our population, people who are dealing with issues related to anxiety, and it could be, work related. So we had a couple books in there about using digital tools to help get you a job, or how to organize your digital life. Sometimes that could be, a stressor, that could be a basis or one part leading to overall anxiety. Again, if you expand your genres, and so we make sure that we have, self-help books on there. We make sure that we have literature and, either mystery novels or books that activate at different reading levels. So, and then when we do these book talks, there'll be specific questions about characters every once in a while, but we avoid the high school English type of book discussion and really focus on how is this therapeutic. And for us, therapeutic means talking about your lived experiences and building your empathetic skills. It could just be a page. Matter of fact, the Kidd and Castano study only used a couple pages of books from literature, and they found, again, a measurable increase in empathetic thinking. Does that help?
Yeah, that's actually really, that's really good to know. And have any of the studies that you're aware of, have they looked at the potential of like an ebook versus a written book? Like if somebody listens to something like this and then we do the discussion, or is it that they really haven't focused on different media?
Oh, if you can try and fund it, they'll do it, right?
Right. Right.
Right. And so if we back up, and that's why we like to use the rhetorical situation, because it's discourse based. We're talking about discourse. So you may think that there is a difference between traditional reading, right? Reading a hard text and analog text and an ebook. They have not found a, this is qualified, they have not found a difference in cognitive processes as long as the ebook platform does not create a barrier. Now, naturally, if the ebook platform creates a barrier to reading, it's just not very good. It's difficult, or it's just something that the reader is not comfortable with, then that's going to affect the efficacy of the reading, correct? So far, the audiobooks that we have, I'm trying to think, we have not found anything that said that there was a difference, again, because it's relying upon the ability to mind read. And by mind read, you're internalizing, you're transporting yourself. There may be differences if the audiobook turns into somewhat of a dramatic reading where you have different characters and so forth. Plays don't do as well, and just reading plays, because one thing about a play is there's very little text or less text, and there's more stage directing, more they're trying to set up the imagery as opposed to relying upon the reader. So that's some of the data there. But ebooks and regular books, no, as long as the platform doesn't get in the way. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. That's really great.
Yeah, and so that's, that's one of the issues that we had to research, we had to address because of various, digital access, correct? Or just access to these books. We wanted to make sure that we had a variety of formats too. So when we're looking at these books and these book lists, if these books are like, wow, these are like, the gold standard, that's the term we use, if this is the gold standard for what we're doing. But if there's only one or two copies in, the library's collection or the library system, then it's not really going to be that helpful if patrons can't read it. It may be fun for us to read or to talk about, but really it's delivering those. So what we found, especially up in Vermont, because they have a slightly different system, that we had to make sure that there was, again, anywhere between, I think, 7 and 10 titles, and they had to at least be hard copies and digital copies and audio books, too, for them to be able to get a full participation from the community. So that means that you have to kind of know what books you're going to do beforehand, so you can kind of bring them in, put them on reserve. Doesn't mean you have to have 15 copies of a book or 15 ebook copies. 2 copies of a title, 3 may be sufficient out of a list that has at least 9 books. So we go back to if there's any more questions.
Yes, I do have another question, Dr. Cannon.
Mhm.
We have a question. In your experience, do you believe public libraries should always keep the three-way interaction in this type of program, i.e. book, literature, counselor, expert, patron? What model would you suggest if there's not funding or network for counselor-therapist interaction?
Right, and so this was when we're reaching out to different communities and helping them to start this. That's always a question, is like, do we need all three parts? No, you don't need all three parts. However, the efficacy of the program increases. The reason why I say that, again, going back to therapeutic reading, if I read a book, and I feel good after, that's therapy. And one of the things that the cognitive sciences tells us, this may sound like an aside, but it isn't. When we read a book and we cry, when we read a book and we feel emotion, our brain is not processing that as, oh, this is not real. You are tricking your brain. That's what literature does, is it's kind of hijacking our evolutionary processes that, help us develop. So our brain is actually fooled in thinking that, oh, I'm crying because this is emotional. Your brain thinks you're there. It's not saying it's detached from reality, but there is no neural circuit that says, oh no, this is wrong. It's okay. This is just a book. And so that's why the cognitive science is important. The reason why I bring that up is you can do the book lists. The problem is unless you follow it up or support the reader or the user with other resources, it may be difficult to measure your program to see if it's working, or to fund it, or to allow your patrons to progress and get more help.
And Dr. Cannon, question kind of with that processing, kind of contemplating what's potentially happening as individuals. And I really kind of see that, like, in the kind of the group bibliotherapy piece, if you have a group and you're all reading together and processing and talking and really feeling emotions, as the individuals connect to the emotions in the book, in some way, do they see or find that that's allowing for processing of potentially unprocessed kind of like events or trauma that, maybe can do that in a more effective, less traumatic way for the patrons?
Is there a way to do that?
Well, is that one of the things that you're seeing in the bibliotherapy groups, that it really does allow for the processing of emotions in a way that can provide some healing without really having to go into original traumas that may be too much to process? And
Right.
just the fact that you have a group of individuals in there and really communicating, processing, and basically individuals that don't have the social skill sets, maybe due to trauma, that it really allows for the real time, basically practice of communication skill sets, verbalizing feelings, thoughts, ideas, and that in itself, for individuals who've dealt with trauma, really is a very therapeutic process, just communicating.
Mm-hmm.
So just wondering if that's kind of are you seeing that in the groups that you're doing?
So what we see, we see a lot of that. And it depends on the context, it depends on the exigence, depends on where you are. So, but generally that's the idea of that processing, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're creating these programs and we create these lists and we announce these lists, we're not just giving, the Amazon or back to the cover description of the book and saying, hey, we're going to discuss this. We make sure that as a participant, as a reader, when you sign up on this, that this is a different program, that we deal with difficult issues, or we may deal with issues in the community through a book. So there's always that notice. And then when you get there, yes, you're encouraged, and we do everything to encourage you to, to have that therapeutic moment if you want. Sometimes it happens when you're talking. We've had the teenagers, you could see them, the young adults, and they're, and they're processing and so forth, but that's a good thing. And we also tell them that if you feel uncomfortable, turn your camera off. If you want to leave, go ahead. You should not feel bad for processing. But on the other hand, there may be people who don't want that, right? There may be people who want to participate in the program, but don't want to process their emotions maybe out in the open or through dialogue in that way. They may be more private. So they can participate by listening. And this is where we get to the book list. What we also do is, because we're talking about themes, we will talk about the other books, and sometimes we may, the conversation may be adjacent to something. So they may talk about the character in one of the graphic novels in that difficult time. But also included in our book lists are those we call them the neuro track. I'm going to get to the tracks in a second, where it's a murder mystery, where you are doing similar repair work and you don't have to process your emotions at all. And the reason why we created this track, and it's very interesting, is what we had at our residential treatment center is we had more and more of the residents talking about their books in group therapy. However, the book wasn't kind of on the agenda. It was a different book or just a different set of exercises. And they kept saying, well, I want to talk about this book, and they want to talk about this book. And it was, so one, yay, that's successful, it's working, right? That's exactly what we wanted. However, the counselors were finding it disruptive. So how do we find an alternative? So we said, well, why don't we do this? Let's create a fourth track of books that still does that therapeutic work without that level of intentionality. And that would be reading, a book like Gone Girl that has those textual features that activate your theory of mind without having to identify with a particular issue. Is that helpful? Did I answer your question at all?
Yes. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and that's the key, I think, to responsive librarianship, is personalizing it. Again, in the old days, the German psychologist with the white beard would have said, read this book. It'll be good. You identify it. You'll get a good cry out of it or something. Some people didn't want to do that. Liz Brewster she's a researcher and academic over in the UK, and she's done a lot of research on that. And taking surveys of people who participated in book clubs, a lot of them felt like, I want to read to escape. And a lot of people say, well, is reading for entertainment good? Well, we can make it good and therapeutic. So those who didn't want to process directly, because they didn't want the triggers, we gave them a separate track. And it's flexible and it's personalized. So that's the idea of responsive librarianship. It's not just on the book, but on a theme, a series of books, and then bringing in. So I know I haven't answered the other question, which is, do we have to do all three? You don't necessarily have to do all three. Let's say you don't have the resources to do the book club. Well, create some really strong reading prompts with directions on how to do it. Or maybe you can make a video that you can put on your platform where, maybe a librarian provides some reading prompts and someone can do this at home. We always have to be mindful and aware that, we're very privileged sometimes. We have a car, we have an ability to get somewhere. Some people are working night shifts, some people don't have transportation. I think that's one of the issues in Pasco that we're trying to deal with, is not, You know, being able to go somewhere, get in your car and go is a very privileged act, and not everyone has that. So if you're in a community where that may be an issue, well, then again, it's flexible enough and you can personalize it, create some reading prompts. You know, they have them in the, I don't have my book right here, but they have them in the back of a lot of books. One of the latest editions of Ocean at the End of the Lane has group reading prompts. They're slightly different than what we would ask for, but that is one way to do it. I would not just do reading lists. So, and then community experts. If you don't have the ability to bring in community experts, see if there are any online resources. The idea is to take what you do already. We're experts in being, you know, librarians and doing really good library programming. Theme it. And so bring in some of those resources that you may have. Maybe you have some online resources about mindfulness or yoga, or just, you know, simple stretching at your desk or at work. You know, if I'm a waiter or waitress or something, and I don't have the time to do, you know, stretching, maybe stretching at work could be helpful, because that could help relieve anxiety. Pain increases anxiety. Does that help? I want to make sure I answered that question too, because that is a question that comes up a lot. How you do these 3 steps is up to you. Does not have to be face-to-face, does not have to be live, but a good way, but you want to draw, you know, extend the information seeking behaviors of your patrons. Answer that.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, okay. Wow. Great. Excellent. And so if we go back to, let's see, how are we doing on time, Melanie? Let's see, are we doing good?
It is now 2:30. Doing good.
Great.
Did you want to take a break?
Yeah. So I was thinking maybe give everyone a break too. How
much time would you like?
Let's see, is 5-10 minutes. What do you foresee being good?
Is 5 or 10 minutes good? What does everybody online think? You want 5 or 10 minutes? 10 minutes. Okay, we'll take 10. So we'll be back here at basically 2:40. 2:40.
Sounds good. Excellent.
All right, everybody. Thank you. Yes, 2:40.
I'm going to put this on mute.
We are back in 1 minute.
Right. I don't know if you noticed, Melanie, I've changed my background. I'm in my office today.
I love that. Yes, I did notice.
Yes,
Love your
weird,
office.
yes, it's a weird feeling to be back. I've been coming here, like maybe I've been like 4 times.
Right.
But it's always a weird feeling.
To come back and nobody's there, right?
Well, yes, to come back and nobody's there, and then to realize that usually all the books that I used to have here, I've had more, are now at home.
Right.
Like, now I've got these, 2 places, but the internet is a lot quicker here.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
a lot easier.
Yeah, I'm kind of juggling the 2 places too, the home and office space. And the challenge is to make sure that you have whatever documents you need for where you're going. So it's a little bit extra thinking to make sure that you have that.
Yeah, I mean, my camera is on all my files, so that's why it's elevated. I'm just carrying a bunch, like, just in case I need it. So,
yeah.
Let's see what time we have.
We have 2:40. Is everybody ready to get started? Okay.
Sound good?
Yeah, let's go.
All right. Now, before I move on to the next section, I wanted to go back to this discussion. And it's one of those things I feel is really important to understand. And as you can see, I've gone back to this slide. Everyone can see it, right? It looks like just numbers and stuff. But the idea is that these are books that have been studied by not only empirical science, psychologists. And I would argue that those who do testing in this discipline are probably some of the most rigorous researchers. And we have a group of books. You see Gone Girls, not quite in the middle, it's to the right there. And the books to the right are non-literature, and the books to the left are literature. And so we have 24 keywords, and we go down to 8, we go left to the right. Now this is, again, and this is what I think is the most fascinating. This is not traditional bibliotherapy where you read a book and you feel good. And then you think, well, this book should be good for someone else. This is empirical science. They've done laboratory tests. They bring in hundreds and hundreds of people, and they, these psychological batteries. And that's what the data says, is that these books are helpful, and they activate your theory of mind, and they actually improve your social processing. Now, there's something else. Diana Tamir in her lab in Princeton University, she's a neuroscience, and she follows Kidd and Castano, David Kidd, who's up in Harvard. She did a similar test, but what she did is she uses MRIs, fMRIs, functional MRIs. And it's not just one picture of the brain, it is a series of images of the brain before they read, during reading, and after they're reading. And what they have found, what she has found in her lab, is neuroplasticity. The brain is physically being improved by reading this genre, or this, it's not quite a genre, but these types of books. And this is fascinating. This is something that I'm surprised we're not shouting from the top of the mountain, is that you can repair physical damage to your brain by reading these books. And the more of these books that you read, the more repair occurs. So again, going back to our question, well, if you didn't want to process or do that emotional processing, you can get the same type of work done with different books. Gone Girl, again, it's nothing that deals really with emotions, right? It's a good read. The Tiger's Wife, which is very interesting. It's a mystery book about a young woman who's a medical student in the Balkans, a doctor. Her grandfather is missing. He's a doctor too, and he died. And she's trying to figure out, well, why did he die in this location? So she's traveling trying to piece together the last week of his life, what's going on. Because it uses, you can see there's 14 keywords, which is very good, but it's not just the words, it's the passages, the words, the concepts around these words. It does a lot of repair. It's one of the strongest books. And you can use it for doing that identity work. Oh, I have a loss, I lost my grandfather. Here's a book that you could read as a similar thing, or you could just read as a good mystery book. So I hope everyone understands that this is not traditional research or the library research or social science research we've done in the past. This is a hard science, not saying it's better, but there's a lot of research out there like this based on our neuroplasticity, or the ability of our brain to repair itself. So these books, if you're exigents, one of the exigents that I'm dealing with in Vermont is people who have, cognitive deficits due to brain trauma. Let's try this. This repair is not saying that if you have brain trauma, it's going to make it all go away, but because your brain and the neural roadways, the neural circuits, the connections, the networks, because of this plasticity, they can find a way around, and this is one way to do it. So I hope everyone understands and comes away with this amazing finding, and somehow finds a way to put these types of books into your program. I think it's just fascinating. What it does is it just opens up another avenue for people who don't want that, to go through the emotional triggers in therapy. Does anyone have any questions before we go on to the next section? No questions?
I do not see questions.
Oh, okay, excellent. I always get nervous because I don't think I'm really that clear. I always ask my students, like, really, am I that clear?
You are that clear.
Oh, thank you, I appreciate
You use
it.
a lot of big words, though.
Oh, I'll try and cut that down. Please, if you don't understand, trust me, I don't understand some of these words. If you don't understand the word, just let me know. When we're talking about calibration, it's like translation. It's just like trying to make two people who speak different languages, speak the same, right? It's kind of like that. If you don't understand something, please raise your hand. Let's see. So if we're talking about and this is getting into your original question, Melanie, about, and I think we had what does the base model look like? What does a scheme look like? So you have these evidence-based reading lists. Again, we're not just doing the one type of bibliotherapy where you identify and have catharsis and so forth. This is evidence-based, data-driven. We create these lists, and we theme them. The guided reading groups, how you create a guided reading group. Research does support, and that was one of the things I had to do for Vermont, because they wanted a lot of research on this, is that guided reading groups or guided reading is the efficacy of that is better than non-guided. And so that's the data. Doesn't mean the non-guided doesn't work. It's just that better efficacy. And then the third one is that community-based instructional programs. And this is, kind of how we get community ownership. Again, if that's something you can't do, find a way, an alternative. There's always, look at your ecology. There's different ways to pluck people out and bring them into your ecology. Today, there are some expectations that if you're going to do a book club online or any type of program, is you need at least a stable communication environment for your participants. What does that mean? At least your internet connection should be stable. You should pick a platform that is comfortable for you and appropriate. So for example, one library system is using GoToWebinar. And then I think we decided to do for Temple Terrace and Pasco do Zoom, but you have to register beforehand, get a code and so forth. So we want to make sure that it's stable and appropriate for everyone. You want to make sure that the collection you have, you want to evaluate your collection to fit your needs. I've given this presentation to the Bureau of Prisons. I don't want to say zero money for libraries, but let's say close to. They're not getting a lot of books in donation as they used to before in decades past, so they have very little resources. So the idea is that this program is flexible enough where you don't need to buy extra books if you have the money to, if you want to do a grant to kind of shore up or add books to your collection. But you could really do this with no extra funding, and that's the idea because it's flexible enough. So the books, what we're looking at, and you can call them genres. I don't like to call them genres because they mean different things for different disciplines. So we call them tracks. So there are 4 tracks, 4, not 8, of books. So CBT, we define those as your self-help, didactic, effective, and we'll get into these. Effective is going to be literature. Neuro is that one I showed you that does a lot of text analysis, and then visual. So cognitive-based therapy text, an example of this is Feeling Good, Dr. David Burns. This is actually an excellent title to use. For example, one of our groups that's dealing with anxiety, we put this book in. This is probably one of the, I don't want to hyperbole, but one of the most studied titles in bibliotherapy is this book, and it seems to do well with a broad population. And it covers a lot of issues, anxiety, depression, so forth. And there are some diagnostic tests in there that you can take. And, it's a Likert scale to see how you're feeling. It's a good all-around book. I think it was first published, I have there in 1980. It's gone through so many editions. He's still, refining it based on the science and so forth. It's always a good book to have for CBT. Let me see my arrows here. In CBT, what you have to remember that these types of books are looking at behavior modification, which is good. For example, if you're a smoker, you want to quit smoking, and it's like How to Quit Smoking book, they talk about, it's all about behavior modification to deal with a very physical addiction. Your body changes, smoking cigarettes, because you're addicted to the nicotine and other things, but you're also addicted to the behaviors. So, you got to be careful. Some people like to smoke after they eat. They like to smoke when they're out in bars or in social settings, or maybe when they wake up, or coffee. So it talks about, so CBT talks about promoting good, healthy practices to deal with issues. So it's about behavior. And sometimes you can use behavior to correct a physiological problem. Problem though is that it could be negative, neuronormativity. Like there's a lot of, this is what a healthy brain looks like. We all know there's no such thing as a healthy brain or a normal brain. There's no such thing as that. And it could also be, there's patriarchal problems, like who is telling me what's normal behavior. So it depends on, the book. So I give you an example in the DSM, dealing with addiction. It gets into some vague questions about work and employment and so forth. And the way that it's expressed can be somewhat normative. So when you're dealing with CBT and you're talking about behaviors, you always have to keep that in the back of your mind. And this is the process, is identification of an issue or behavior, developing strategies, and then the application of those strategies. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything here. So, and then the application of those strategies to help modify or change your behavior. cognitive-based therapy texts work. They work well, but just like other types of books, they don't work for everybody. It's very popular. No one really does pure CBT today, I think, my understanding, because schools today, I think they like to teach a mix. Well, Melanie, you would know. Is that correct? Nothing's really pure CBT. They always, it's like a mix of others.
Yeah, I actually, Peter, I didn't hear the question clearly. I'm sorry.
Oh, what I was saying is, like, I think schools today there's no pure CBT therapy anymore. I guess they like to it's very powerful and works, but they like to mix in, other things.
Yes, I think that's very popular, really, to mix in other types of
Right.
therapy at this point,
So,
for sure. Yep.
Right. So, like, dealing with addiction from CBT is very painful. Whereas if you can kind of like maybe, methadone clinics and so forth, that's not CBT. That's actually being aware of the physical processes, right? And so that's that mix. Like, it hurts when you're, withdrawn from drugs.
Withdrawing, yes.
Yeah, so
Yep.
It's not. But
there's the physical element, there's the different elements that the individuals are dealing with, and that physical element is very real, and probably, the first piece that you won't be trying to do any therapy during that physical withdrawal phase.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so that's why you always have to be careful of CBT texts. They're good, they're great, but behavior modification doesn't solve every problem. And another thing is I like to bring up to people is, if you're dealing, we had at DACO a lot of sexual assault survivors, right? And then then there's depression, and then there's addiction, PTSD.
And I think that's where those mystery books and, different type of books where they can relate really basically in themes and make these connections that make sense, but that really don't bring out the trauma that way, because that really, especially if somebody has really severe trauma, it really is a body takeover. So, there's so many different elements that really need to be kind of considered. And that's definitely something. And I think that in libraries, that's one of the reasons exploring some of these other types, the mystery books, some different types of fiction that there's a lot that you can really do without going into that. And I think it can, for the brain function and really developing new neural pathways, it can be very effective not to get into that really bringing up the trauma, because it just takes individuals in a totally different direction, especially if they've not processed it before. Right,
exactly. Like, it would be difficult if I had a book club that was the first time they processed it.
Yeah.
But
I think you really could, if you have a certain mystery book, it won't really bring you into those places, but it can really bring in some of those themes that make it very relatable and almost, I think, more powerful, because it helps to start to bring an understanding and a perspective that wasn't available before, because there's just so much connection or so much entrenchment really in the trauma story. Because when you're really entrenched in that trauma story and you really have never had any therapeutic intervention, going that route could be a really good, effective first start.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah, and again, I think everyone's aware of you, Melanie, but we've had a lot of discussions, and integrating, if you can, that's that fourth piece. Mental health professionals, social workers, social work interns into your program can go a long way and can help answer questions that basically I'm not qualified to answer. Maybe you don't need to answer them, but it's a good resource again.
Yeah. And I think it just opens up the possibilities in programming to a whole different level. And we're really starting, to step into some of that. I know with our social work interns, they did go to a homeless women's shelter, and they actually worked with the youth and brought some books in, just, some picture books, and they really had an amazing, really great experience just with the work that they were doing with the younger youth. And I would say they were more middle school age and down. But it was really good. It was really good. And I think that really kind of represents a way that we can make partnership or connecting with these different social service agencies, especially when we have our social workers. And basically, if you start programming like that in those off-site social service agencies, you really are then bringing a linkage to the library to, as you continue, that that you're opening them up to the potential to use it, be aware that the library is there for so much more. So I think it's really a great outreach type opportunity to begin to build some partnerships with some of the social service agencies. And I know with our digital youth discussion group, that's another area that we are connecting with quite a few different social service agencies and literally creating a pipeline of services and developing a program that we want this responsible librarianship to be a part of. But again, with that social worker, the formatting and the framing of the program can really expand to such a degree, and we're really interested in exploring that.
Right, and I think this might be, maybe we could ask a question, because we've had this conversation, the three of us actually, about social workers. Is anyone here from a library that has social workers? Do you think we can get a count on that? Do you think, Melanie? Or, and you just raise your hand and because it would be interesting to see if this is a resource.
So why don't we put it in the chat? If your library has a social worker or access to a social worker, let us know.
Right, because it kind of changes the dynamic of the program. That's what we're finding. Because the two residential programs we had, naturally we had social workers there, we had mental health professionals, and so we had the luxury of starting out with that, and we don't want to leave that luxury behind. But I think Melanie and I, we've had this conversation, Affy too, about we may be the only programs where it's integrated, where it's not just a social worker there present in a space, but integrated into library programs. So I think that again, if you don't have the resources for that, if you live by a university, there's social work interns, they need the hours, and that's what we're doing. We're creating this partnership. So if we get back to, and we can talk about social workers more, but CBT, that's the first track. Again, this is our toolbox of texts. And then the effective base text. So this is going to be your fiction. These could be YA novels. They could be just, light and easy reads, but they're fiction. So we have two types. So the first one that we really loaded up on, and this is the conversation we're having all the time, is these mirror books, these YA books. Oh God, some YA books are so sad, right? They don't end very well, but they're good. They're good mirror books, and they simulate the reader's own situation, which is really helpful in the way that YA books, they have this ability to attach themselves to the reader. And they go through the identifications, catharsis and insight, and that's, and then they start talking about it with their counselors or something, or, it's just something that you can internalize. Effective identification is traditional bibliotherapy. There are different types of books now. You don't have to read, adult. You can read YA books, and they're just as interesting. Sometimes they're easier, and when you use YA books, it kind of opens up your toolbox again. Remember, that's what we're looking at, is expanding our toolbox so we can reach more people and personalize this process. And then here's an example. I always use this example, Speak by Laurie Hall Sanderson. It's about, a sexual assault survivor, but it's also about, patriarchy and someone trying to find their voice when everyone else is trying to, to silence her. So again, we talked about this. We've been having this conversation. This is triggering. It can be triggering. So, but again, if you're in a good, group, or if you're in a good environment, this is, these are the type of books that are very therapeutic. And then we have effective narrative, and this is based on narrative theory, which was that #1 thing that we talked about. And this talks about the author, implied reader, and the real reader. So if we look at, narrative theory, and I have down there this, little diagram, if you've ever taken any English courses. This is, narrative theory, what it looks like. The real author, implied author, narrator, narratee, implied reader, real reader. It's this work that we're looking to do in between the implied reader and the real reader. So here's an example of 2 different series, right? He wrote these books for me, and that's the difference between the real reader and the implied reader. You can also use Harry Potter books too. Harry Potter books were probably written for teens and preteens. We found that our residents, the adult residential treatment center, loved them. Why not? And well, there's a lot of reasons. But anyways, it was very popular. And they would say, God, it seems like, I mean, really, this is a quote. He or she, wrote these for me. And the idea of what's going on is you're doing work in that space in between the real reader, which is a drug addict, and the implied reader, which is a person who reads, a member of the society who does not have any addiction, maybe a teen, preteen, or something like that. So when they start reading, that gap is very big. And what we find from the data and the research is the more you read, you bring that gap, you close that gap. And that helps them go, oh, someone wrote a book for me. It seems very trivial, but therapeutically is very powerful. And so that's based on that narrative theory. And what it is as a person reads a book, if I read a book and Melanie reads a book, we are reading 2 different books. The plots are the same, the characters are the same, but we are actually reading 2 different books because we bring our lived experiences into the book and we weave it in. So what happens is when someone is reading, under this track, they're rewriting their narrative and closing that gap. And that's the idea behind that. And that's all based on data and so forth. Go ahead.
One of the things too I see or think is that it really helps the reader really not feel alone or so alone anymore. And it kind of really opens up the world and steps out of the trauma story in a sense of really starting to open up to the perspective that they're to be able to see, especially like the Narnia and, these 2 that you picked, some of that juvenile literature was just really very enjoyable. And I have definitely seen that in the potential of what it really does in opening up the ability to, start to explore potential oneself through a different lens. And so that's one of the powerful things about using books. It's really amazing because I think the way that it helps heal the brain is very much a process, and the enjoyment of reading a book becomes really a new tool in helping to navigate basically triggers and trauma. It's something that individuals can start to go to, that they feel safe to go to, because triggering becomes something that is in a sense a prison, because like everywhere you go, you can't control how much triggering happens. But the process of reading really seems to help in developing a better sense of self.
Mars and others, Mars et al., he does a lot of research, and that's exactly what he said, Melanie. It's wonderful the way that you say that, because that is evidence-based. We may not think that, but it's what cognitive science tells us, and it's exactly that. And it goes back to this idea. If anyone has read David Eagleman, he's done a series, he's a neuroscientist, and our brains are socially constructed, and we socially construct our brains different ways. And one of those ways is through language. And if you can reconstruct your brain through reading, then that is a good thing. And that is something that's possible. And it's not just something we're just thinking, oh, reading is good. Language constructs our reality. These books are language. And that's why we keep going back to Rhetorical Situation, because it's discourse. This is something that's in science. One of the things I didn't add, and I can add, are the sources that if you need this for stakeholders. And so this is all evidence-based. And so, we use texts, books, narratives to construct our reality. And that's how these neural pathways, I love what you said, creating new neural pathways. That's how they are done. Yep. Through our interaction. And it doesn't matter. We can experience in real time, or we can experience in a book. Our brain doesn't know.
Yeah, our brain doesn't know. And if you could provide those references, for sure, I'd love to have those, because in the research that we're doing, it would be great to have those to be able to
absolutely.
access. Awesome, thanks.
And then let's see, so then we have our neuro-based text, and this is what we talked about before with those numbers. So there is a known, we call it our gold standard, right? We have gold standards in collection development and determining a strength of a collection. So there's a known corpus of texts that activate theory of mind processing. Again, theory of mind processing is one of two things that we're born with. The other is this ability to recognize faces. But theory of mind processing is the reason why we're able to kill woolly mammoths, right? And survive and eat and not get eaten by saber-toothed tiger, because it allows us to work together, in society. So there is a known corpus, a known group of texts that activate this theory of mind processing, that lead to cognitive repair, not just talking theoretical. Maybe this is, physical through fMRIs. I can't say proven, science doesn't prove anything, but it supports the idea that there's cognitive repair, and it builds empathy. And I think that's something that, especially today, you watch the news or anything going on in the world, empathetic thinking is it's like supply and demand. There's a lot of supply for empathetic thinking, and that's just the ability to think about someone's feelings or state of mind. We're doing that all the time. It's kind of hard. I always joke with people, and I always have my students turn on their camera, because it's very difficult to talk online, right? Because we don't have that ability to communicate. Empathetic thinking includes body languages and thinking and going like this and all that. We are trained to do that. Some people are not as developed. Some people are more developed. But these neuro-based texts, evidence has shown that they can help build empathy and improve social ability. We're looking for change over time. That doesn't mean right away. You're not going to read a book and go, hey, now I'm super social. No, the idea is for people who have that ability, have that skill. Maybe it's underdeveloped. We all have, not all, and I'll tell you why in a second, but it's a skill that needs to develop. We are born with the ability. There's more development that can take place. And again, I said this before, The Tiger's Wife is a wonderful example of neuro-based text. It's a great read. A lot of libraries have this also. Gone Girl, I was surprised when this happened. This was the one disagreement I had with the original Kid and Castano, because they thought mystery books like this were not literature. And so they inaccurately put them in another group. And so when we were doing our text analysis on an XY plane, like we learned that in geometry or something like that. This book was always trying to go over to the other books when we kept running these text analysis. It was always like in the wrong classroom. And it's like, I should be over there. And so when we put it with the other books that were literature, it fit in well. It fit in just fine. And so that's a great example. Now, this is our last track, visual-based text, and you can use these for a variety of reasons. I have two wonderful examples, Lighter Than My Shadow, written by Katie Green, and Sobriety. Lighter Than My Shadow talks about body images and the negative effects of that. It's one ontological or one type of eating disorder that comes from that. Katie Green wrote this. It's a huge book. I have it somewhere over here. And she wrote it as part of her therapy. Wonderful. And then Sobriety by Daniel Moore is it's the big blue book. It is a graphic novel version of that. And what it is, it's a vignette, it's small vignettes of each different type of person that goes through Alcohol Anonymous. So both wonderful. And they're good, again, for literacy issues or readers who are with low motivation. Confession, I was not very motivated as a child to read. I was a questioner, I guess. But there were points in my life where I wasn't very motivated. And graphic novels, visualization helped. The process can be effective, can be CBT. And then there's the third one, which is, again, this is part of our evidence-based research. It's based on what's called the facial action coding system. What? And so the idea is that graphic novels are good for folks who may have certain conditions. For example, folks who are on the spectrum, autism spectrum, who have difficulty recognizing social situations. So one of the things, our faces are the primary vehicle for processing emotion. There's a lot of good research out there. Our faces, help us in our mind reading. And so graphic novels, depict certain types of faces. So you see the picture there at the high detail on the bottom, and then there's one with low detail at the top. So some individuals on the spectrum have difficulty reading faces, our faces from the fusiform facial area, because of the detail. Research has found that less detailed faces that express emotion can be interpreted by those on the spectrum. And it can help, it's not going to repair so much as what happens is it helps build a library of faces and emotions. And so this was one of the book talks and reading sessions that we had, was trying to have our teens and preteens match up faces and emotions. And so what the research suggests that sometimes, these graphic novels, that are more abstract, they call more abstract faces, might be useful in developing social skills. So, time for discussion or questions. I know I hit you up with a lot there. We're almost done. And this is about where I wanted to get to, one quick section after, but the idea is, have you ever used or recommended alternative or non-traditional forms of text in your library to a patron, even if it's like an audiobook? I do a lot of audiobooks these days. And so thinking about that, and each one of these discussions are things that we've discussed as a group in our lab and developing this program. So these are not just, silly things, but things that help you think about crafting a responsive librarianship scheme. We can take a minute here, and if anyone has a question too, I don't mind answering it.
Any questions here? No questions.
Oh, wow. Excellent. So I think I've kind of given away all my hints about some of these alternative, non-traditional texts. And really, I would say that, bridge copies of books are good. Short stories, one of those texts on the list there, that Kidd and Castano study that is, high on TOM, theory of mind activation, is a short story. It's called The Vandercook. Took me forever because I kept looking for a book. I'm like, no, it's a short story. It's just 3 pages long. It's amazing the work that it does. So maybe books, aren't your thing. You can do short stories. You can do this work through short stories. You just have to, do the work beforehand, research the text, and ask again, why would I be recommending this? If it's a short story that deals with a situation that other people may have, then realize that that's, identification effective, right? If it's, like the Vandercook, if it's just going to activate theory of mind processing, then that's another reason. Why would you suggest that? Maybe because we don't want that triggering. Maybe we just want to talk about something that doesn't have to deal with trauma. Again, audiobooks are good. Graphic novels. I don't know if anyone's heard of Graphic Medicine. They have every year they have an annual conference, and it's an organization that was started by doctors and nurses, and it's grown to the point where they have 1 year conference in the United States and one in Europe. I think they still have it. I don't know about the pandemic though. We've gone a couple times and presented posters there, but they have a website too. And those are alternative ways to talk about health and wellness. If I give you a sheet or a book about a CBT book about your disease, or I don't like to use the term disease about, or your issue that you're dealing with, it may be complicated if you're trying to deal with everything, the secondary effects of that. Whereas if I give you a graphic novel of someone that deals with that, and I give you a wonderful example, is I just read it, is a cute story. It's called El Defo. It won an award, I think. And the little rabbits and stuff, but the author's experience growing up in the 60s, mostly 70s and 80s, with a hearing impairment. And she had to wear a very large hearing aid, and just growing up with not only, the issue of, having this, body, this problem with her body, and she was sad about it, but the social issues of a young girl growing up and trying to fit in with everyone else, and having these, back then the hearing aids were huge for classrooms, had this big box with this microphone, having to deal with that. It's a wonderful, it's called El Defo because that was her alternative identity, kind of like a superhero. You could read a book about someone, fiction book about someone dealing with hearing loss, and dealing with, embodiment issues, or a graphic novel that was just wonderful, that it's long, that went through all the emotions, all the experiences to, and just, she's still, a young adult. And then there's a little portion at the end when she's, as an adult, reflecting back and why she wrote it. That's an alternative text that you can use to deal with those same issues. And it's kind of like othering, and that's where we put that in with our teams, is, the issue, our exigence is othering, when you're placed as an other, an outsider, or some.
Dr. Cannon, I wanted to
Yeah.
bring up here too. I know I'm part of the ALA's Film and Media Roundtable, and I'm also on the Notables Committee. And some of those videos, like, they're absolutely amazing. And, I think kind of another form that can be used. And some of them are, I mean, some of them are very triggering, and there's quite a few international videos. So they really show different types of struggle from kind of all over the world, and different types, like I said, different types of struggles. So it really is another way to kind of, again, open up the view in understanding and relating. And again, I think one of the things that's really strong is that individuals with trauma feel very much alone, but in seeing even different types of struggle around the world and seeing people overcome it and come through it in different ways. And I know one in particular was a video that a young boy for a year recorded interactions with his friends, and one was having a pretty severe alcohol problem. And, you know, it was just so therapeutic to really see the way that because he was actually dealing with his own struggle at home, but it was very interesting to see how each individual kind of dealt with their struggles, and to see some teens kind of do that too. So, you know, I think it's kind of another way that really just representing different types of struggles and being able to relate, in essence, kind of works in the same way. So I just wanted to put that out there, because I know we're doing another, it's a 2-year, we're doing another book film list this year. And of course, the films this year are very representative of what's going on. So it's another good resource. So the Film and Media Roundtable Notables film list are another really great resource, I think, that's potentially to use.
So that could be, I think, a great example for the third piece, right? That, you know, you may not have a community expert, or, you know, you may not have the resources, but, you know, ALA organization there has done the work for you. And you know, they use these films in treatment too. And so your library can provide a link in this theme module, right? For you to watch at home if you can't bring in someone, you know, in your community, if you don't have the resources, or just because of the pandemic and different things going on, maybe you don't want. But I think that's a great idea. And again, what you're doing is you're taking, you know, these films and you're adding it to the ecology, right? So that's why I think thinking ecological, you know, thinking in terms of a model, what can you take? And that, you know, that would have been, you know, that's the answer we're looking for in that first question. Like, what can you add to ecology? That's great. Boop, put that in, and there you go. And your ecology expands. Doesn't make it more complicated, excuse me. I think it makes it more useful. And then you have all these tools, and, you know, the program is flexible. That is wonderful. And, you know, when we're done here, we'll talk more about that. I think that's, I'd love to hear more about that work. You know, and when we do part 2, part 3, we're going to talk about, I think, you know, incorporating this into your programming and theme-based programming. This is, I know we're about done here. And it's really just, you know, these monthly lists, these book talks in the library program, these are things that we all do as librarians. We do this. Responsive librarianship just personalizes it. It's theme-based. It looks at exigencies, problems, and then just tries to use, you know, these discursive tools to solve them. Let's see, I don't think I have, oh yeah, and just like anxiety. So we have book list, anxiety, book talks, midnight library, hyperbole and a half, where the crawdads sing. You know, this is one piece of a book list that we have. And then we have mindfulness breathing as our community expert. So this is one, you know, a snapshot of one, you know, themed responsive librarianship module that we have. I know we're out of time here.
Yeah, so. Out of time. That Where the Crawdads Sing is a great book.
Yeah,
a great book.
So part 2 is coming up next month. Please come by. This is going to be more application in part 2, and I think we're going to be doing something with Miami-Dade where we're doing this kind of stuff, but you bring your own. Right? I think that's what we're talking about. I don't want to give it away too much. But, you know, we're expanding these programs here. So If anyone has any questions, feel free to email me. It's Peter Cannon, CANNON, at usf.edu. Or, you know, if you're talking with Melanie, she can always, you know, relay my information. I want more people, I want people to steal my idea. It's not really my idea. I want people to steal this, take it, and put it in their own libraries. I don't own this at all. So I really, you know, my dream is to get this out into the community. So that's it.
Awesome, Peter, because, or Dr. Cannon, because we want to get it out into the community and we really want to use it. And I think a lot of people could really be helped with this program. Thank you so much for your work on it.
No, thank you for having me.
Awesome. So do we have any last questions? A thank you. I see a thank you.
Oh.
It's great information, Dr. Cannon.
And I'll provide a list of resources.
Awesome. That'd be great.
Distribute to everybody.
Okay. I think that's it.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Hopefully we'll see you next month. And if you have any questions, just email me.
Awesome. Next month, I think is February 11th, same time, same place. I'll make sure that everybody is set with that as well. All right.
All right. Take
Thank
care,
you,
everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, Dr. Cannon.
Thanks,
Okay.
Kathy.
Talk to you later, right? Tomorrow.
Tomorrow morning. Okay.
All right.
That's it.
Everybody take care.